Hello everyone, welcome, good afternoon. We are very happy to welcome Professor Danny Pieters, who will be with us today this afternoon, and who will deliver a lecture on the topic of social security and democracy. Professor Pieter is the Professor Emeritus at KU Leuven University in Belgium, and he has an extensive experience both in the field of law and social security, which is the main topic of his scientific interest, but also in the questions of democracy. As you could have seen from his biography, he used to serve as a member of the Belgian Parliament, first the lower house and then the Senate. At some point he was even the president of the Belgian Senate. And right now, apart from his duties concerning the teaching at KU Leuven, he is also the judge at the Constitutional Court of Belgium. So I assume that both segments of this topic will be very thoroughly discussed and well covered. This is not the first time for Professor Pieters in Belgrade, but this is his first time at the Faculty of Law. So I sincerely hope that it will be a most enjoyable experience both for you and for him. Professor Pieters, I wouldn't like to take any more of your time, so I would invite you to start with your lecture as soon as you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for having me. Thanking also Philip and my former students who have showed up from many years ago. And of course, so many of you who came and who were, I hope, not forced too much to come to this lecture. I hope you will not regret it too much. I'm going to speak about social security and democracy. And let me start with saying something about conceptual framework, social security and democracy. If we look at the European Union and its member states, we will see that there is in their constitutional instruments a fundamental commitment to democracy and social security. And you can see that in the preamble of the Treaty of the European Union, you can see that in the national constitutions of the member states, and you can see it also in the Constitution of Serbia. Already in the Constitution of Serbia, in its first article, this commitment to democracy and social justice is formulated, and then in Article 69, 70, you see then the commitment to social security. So, apparently, drafters of these and similar constitutional texts, lawyers in general, consider that democracy and social security go together well, even strengthen each other. The question is this correct? Is this a happy marriage? Indeed. Or is the relation between democracy and social security somewhat more complex, somewhat more problematic? These are the core questions we would like to address in this contribution. And to do so, we will address subsequently the following topics. Can you have democracy without social security? Can you have social security without democracy? How does democracy impact social security? What about the internal democracy of social security? And how do individual rights question democratically taken social security decisions? It's certainly not my ambition to exhaustively deal with all these aspects of the relation between social security and democracy, but I selected these topics that, in my opinion, could lead for some conclusions which are relevant for the future. But before diving into these questions, these 5 questions, it's important to dwell some longer on the 2 main concepts here, democracy and social security. First, a word about democracy. There is much literature on the concept of democracy. Democracy is usually defined as a form of government of, for, and by the people. That's the formula which goes back to the early presidents of the United States, but government of, for, and by the people. Often it's added that democracy is not the same as a dictatorship of the majority, but that the state becomes really democratic if the rights of people and of minorities are decently protected. The rule of law and the alternation of power are also seen as characteristic for a democracy. Alternation of power, meaning that who today is in power can tomorrow be in the opposition, and vice versa. So, about democracy, government for, of, and by the people, but with those add-ons, individual rights, minority rights, rule of law, and also alternation of power. We distinguish, that's nothing new for you, representative democracy and direct democracy. Representative democracy, the majority of people, where in representative or direct democracies, the majority of people wants to violate human rights of certain groups of people, democracy is, of course, being perverted. On the other hand, one has to recognize that human rights are also mostly not absolute and can be subject to limitations. The question is, however, how far these limitations should go and what should justify them. Also on these questions, visions may differ between the various legal orders. And I'm saying this because we will use this later on to discuss the question to what extent constitutional courts can amend, can revise social security law decisions. So far about democracy. Let us turn now to the other key concept of the contribution, social security. I like to define social security in an international way, because in every country they have their own specific definition, but as the body of arrangements shaping solidarity with people who face a lack of earnings or a threat of lack of earnings, or who face particular costs. And this in the case of some social risks, such as old age, sickness, invalidity, reliance on long-term care, unemployment, maternity, and paternity. In other words, social security deals with providing an income to people who cannot work anymore and therefore not have an earning, or they compensate some costs that society doesn't want the individual to bear alone. Solidarity is a key concept here. Solidarity implies a community of feelings or action within a group, a commitment towards the members of the group. Every social security is based on the idea of solidarity. But this means that there will always be limits to solidarity. Some people will be in the solidarity circle, will be part of the social security system, and others not. In other words, every solidarity system, every social security arrangement will define its personal scope. So that solidarity circle may include all citizens or residents of the country, may include all residents or citizens of a region or of a municipality. It may single out some groups like the workers, the wage earners, self-employed, civil servants, whatever. I'm stressing this because this solidarity aspect, as it will be interesting to compare the solidarity circle of social security with the circle of democratic participation. And we'll see that the two are not always the same. Now, we don't cover any loss of income. We don't cover any threat of loss of income. We don't cover any specific costs. We do that in the case of social risks. Sometimes in English they say eventualities. And the social risk distinguishes itself from other eventualities simply because at a given point in time, in a certain state, one has decided that those risks should not be left on the shoulders of the individual, but should be bared in solidarity. Also, that is important. You may say that's very theoretical. No, it has a very practical consequence. The practical consequence is that social risks vary from country to country. Because from country to country, one might have other ideas of what are those eventualities that should be taken care of by the solidarity circle. So there is not the one idea forever of social security. Okay, so we have said something about democracy, and you will see I mostly forget to push it, so you have to excuse me. So we're now on the first of our 5 questions. Is it possible to have democracy without social security? Is it possible to create democratic paradise in a social desert? There are plenty of arguments to be provided for affirming that you cannot have a developed democratic society without decent social protection, a good social security system for the members of society. Some even go further and state that the minimum level of income is necessary for having the capacity and autonomy to decide and to exercise political rights properly. And thus, that certain form of redistribution is part of the concept of democracy. In other words, for this minority of political scientists, the concept itself of democracy implies a social policy that redistributes income. However, I'd rather prefer to stick to the more traditional political institutional approach of the concept of democracy, which I told you is governed for by the people. This doesn't take away the fact that in order to have a genuine participation of all in the political decision-making, it is necessary that each person should dispose of the necessary means to be able to conduct a decent life. Here I could refer to research we have done some years ago. We interviewed the leaders of social security administrations of 15 Western European countries, asking them what they consider to be most important challenges for the social security. And their answer, and that was something which surprised us because we were expecting to get technical answers or the demography as a kind of major challenge for the future. And their answer was, in the top answers, was formulated in various ways anyhow, was that this relation between democracy, democratic decision-making, and social security was something that they considered to be very important. They said social security is a pillar of democracy, but we see problems here. And this is, in the long run, also the reason why we tried to develop a bit this topic. Social security gives people more equal opportunities to participate in society. It makes an inclusive society possible if democracy is not the dictatorship of majorities of the day, but also cares about human rights of all, including the marginal and the weaker and marginal people. Then social security can indeed be considered a pillar of democracy. End of quote. So, if we may conclude on this first topic, we may say that even if it would go too far to say that a decent social security system is part of the notion itself of democracy, it goes without saying that in order to be a healthy democracy, citizens need to be freed from the fear of not being able to cope the next day. Or to put it differently, if we want all persons to be able to think and contribute to decision-making, to participate, in other words, in democracy, then it is essential to provide them some social security in relation with the major risks of their life. Otherwise, the danger is very big that they will be guided by the old maxim, primum vivere, deinde philosophari. First living, then we can philosophy. So if we don't want that, then we have to take care of social security. This was the answer to the first of the 5 questions. Is it possible, if we can no social security without democracy, if we can accept that a mature democracy cannot do without the decent social protection of the citizens, we can still ask ourselves whether the opposite is true as well. In other words, we need to question whether you cannot have a decent social security system without democracy. And as we shall see hereafter, quite some policy research has shown that you effectively can have good social protection without having democratic government. And it's very easy to start this by simply recalling the origins of the first social insurances introduced in Germany in the second quarter of the 19th century by Chancellor Bismarck, who in the framework of his action against socialists, against democratic emancipation, as a tool to fight that, introduced the first social insurances. And we can make a similar remark in relation with the introduction of social security programs in countries like Soviet Union under Lenin or in pre-war Imperial Japan. All these had relatively good social security, or beginnings of it, and no democracy of it. Some authors have even linked the initial adoption of social security programs in and outside to Europe to the ambition of the rulers to prevent demands for political rights. But let us go a bit further here, because I believe this is is rather interesting. Already in 2002, some researchers, Mulligan, Gill, and Salahi Martin, established that, and I quote, social security policies vary according to economic and demographic factors, but that very different political histories can result in the same social security policy. The effect of democracy was found to be little and partial. If there is any observed difference, they said, democracies will tend to spend a little less of their GDP on social security, grow their budgets a bit more slowly, and cap their payroll tax more often than do economically and demographically similar non-democracies. That's interesting. This shows a kind of negative relation between democracy and social security. Since then, some other authors have tried to get a better understanding of the relation between the non-democracies or autocracies and social protection, and I refer here to Cassini and also to Rasmussen and Knudsen. André Cassini argues that autocracies need some legitimacy and often cannot base this legitimacy anymore on personal charisma, tradition, or ideology, which was very useful in the past for them to have legitimation of their non-democratic ruling. And thus they are compelled to direct their legitimation on the realization of pragmatic claims of the population. And that's most notably the fulfillment of the people's material needs. So in human terms, so to say, if a dictator or someone who is a non-democratic ruler cannot base his authority on charisma, on tradition, on ideology, he needs to do it in another way. And one of those ways is to try to deliver as much as possible social services in order that people are content in material sphere. Rasmussen and Knudsen have stressed the importance of institutionalized parties for the welfare state, both in democracies and non-democracies. What they say basically is it's not so important whether it's a democracy or a not democracy. What is important is that there is a network of institutionalized parties where there is some communication from the bottom upwards and from the top downwards. And thus, if you have that, whether this party is a one-party state kind of, or whether it is in a pluralistic setting, that doesn't matter. It's important to have those big organizations with links eventually with trade unions, with links with other social organizations. And if you have that, then that will improve the status of social security. If you don't have that, that is a problem. Now, the interesting thing of Rasmussen and Knudsen here is that what you can see in many Western European countries nowadays is exactly the opposite. If you take countries like France, if you take Belgium, the Netherlands, many countries who had traditionally parties which were organized with trade unions, which were organized with all kinds of organizations, have lost enormously power. And new political movements have emerged who do not have that basis, which might result in less attention, less protection of social security. Raises then the question, are authoritarian or electoral autocratic governments better to provide social security than democracies? I don't think so. I don't know. As such, this question needs to be approached with caution, as democracies may perhaps not necessarily perform better than some non-democracies, but there is no evidence that democracies necessarily perform worse. Much will depend upon the receptivity for the preferences and the wishes of society, the ability to translate them in a broader approach and to overcome resistance when deciding and implementing social reforms. That's the essence. You need to have in your country a network of communication where the aspirations of the populations are translated upwards, but also where upwards has enough feeling when it tries to reform social security to what's going on at the basis. That's actually what they tell us there. Good. That's what we were saying. Okay. Then the impact of democracy on social security. To discuss the impact of democracy upon social security in all its aspects would, of course, exceed the limits of the present contribution. Therefore, I would like to highlight some aspects of that impact. Aspects we consider to be most important. First, the reflection of the people's preferences concerning social security through policy making in direct and in representative democracies. Second, the different time dimension between the impact of social security and political decisions. And third, the different personal scopes of social security and political representation. So first, let me start the discussion of the impact of democracy upon social security with an anecdote. We have every year in our university courses on social security, comparative social security, European social security, and many Erasmus students participate in it. And we always organize role games at the end, role games to discuss different issues of social security. And that works quite nicely. One of the interesting things is that those students who come to us from various countries, normally when they come from their home countries, have a very critical attitude towards their own social security. Say it's bad and the government doesn't know what they are doing, and students are rather critical, that's good, about social security in their own country. And then we have the role game, where we present students with questions like what would be the ideal system, what would be, how would you organize pensions, how would you organize them? And after very, very few minutes, the students start defending what in their country is the approach. So although they're very critical about social security, at the same time, apparently, they like the way, in big terms, of how social security is organized at home. And that shouldn't surprise us. We should be happy with that, because it seems to prove that democracy functions. That what in one country is important reflects in social security, and what in another country is important reflects there in another social security. If you talk to students from Italy or Spain, the family will be very important. And so you see that they will stress very much the importance of family allowances. And if you talk to countries like Sweden, equal treatment of men and women will be very important. And it will translate there. So that's good. So apparently there is some good relation. And there is more. That's not research, of course, but we have also done, our colleagues from the Faculty of Political Sciences have done also some research in this sense, and they had organized a qualitative research with 3 focus groups focus groups of not students, normal people, and they were asked which criteria should prevail in social welfare distribution. And their findings suggest that the existence of an institutional logic to welfare preferences as to participants to some extent echoed the normative criteria that are more strongly embedded in the institutional structure of the country's welfare regime. Whereas financial need, you should give to the people who need it financially, was the guiding criterion in the UK, reciprocity was then dominant in corporatist, conservative Germany. In other words, there is that link between the content of your social security system, obviously, and what the preferences of your country are. What are the values which are translated? So we can accept as a starting point that in a democracy, it's likely that the overall preferences of a majority of the people will somehow be translated in the way social security is built. That's fine. But let us now examine a little bit closely the impact of the sort of democracy upon social security. And let us start with the country of direct democracy by excellence, Switzerland. In Switzerland, the impact of direct democracy, so deciding by public votation or referenda, the impact of direct democracy on social security has been remarkable. Social insurances have been introduced later in the country than in most Western European countries. Their tax financing has been kept limited, and the social action of the state remained more modest. All that as a consequence of the use of popular vote and referenda. Social issues accounted for about 13% of the total number of popular votes between 1848 and 1989, and between 1990 and 2014, this figure raised to 30. So from all the referenda that were held, in recent years, about 30% are dealing with social security issues. The interesting thing is that, with one exception, all referenda on social security issues were rejecting social security reforms. And in both directions. So social security reforms to introduce a new social benefit, rejected, but also were rejected social reforms to reduce the social security system. But apparently people like to have what they have. It's interesting. All in all, one can conclude that direct democracy has, in that sense, a conservative impact upon social security. In Switzerland, certainly. And I have the impression that in some countries, like Slovenia also, where pension reform was rejected by referendum, you see a similar effect. If you ask the people something about social security, they will answer you, let's keep what we have. Now, in most democratic countries, we don't have direct democracy, of course. We have representative democracies. The expression of the preferences of the population is mediated through political elections for parliament. We have seen the importance of these institutionalized parties. If you have good institutionalized parties, that is good for social security. If you don't have it, that will be more problematic. Here we might encounter a specific problem of our times. In many European countries, as I said, traditional parties have lost quite a lot of their share in the electorate. New parties, sometimes with vague ideas, emerge, lacking very often the same connections to civil society, which may be problematic for social security. Let us move to the next point. If we take a closer look at both democracy and social security, we have to notice some basic differences that might be important. And First one is dealing with other time dimension. Social security is providing security against social risks, that is taking steps today to make the future more secure. That's what social security is about. It's for you when you're old, you when you would get invalid, etc. The time dimension is essential to the concept of social security, and is most clearly appearing in pension schemes, but is not absent in social health care schemes or unemployment benefit schemes, etc. We take measures now in social security for when we or other people become in need of health care, get reliant on long-term care, become old, etc. The most clearly the time dimension appears with relation to pensions, whether they are funded schemes or whether they are repartition-based. That's not important. We try to make the future a bit more secure in a number of years from now. In repartition-based systems, this expected income is basically linked to the evolution of the labor markets and income out of work. Repartition-based system supposes that when I'm paying now for my pension later, that others will pay for my pension later and will be able to do, will work and will have enough income to pay also for me. In a funded system, the future income I am expecting depends upon the financial markets. If the financial markets do very well, I will have a nice pension. If they do very badly, I may end up with no or very little pension. In both cases, the future is uncertain. In both cases, although most prominently in a repartition logic, but not only, social security pensions are characterized by intergenerational solidarity. Solidarity between actual generation of workers, citizens, and their counterparts 20, 30, 40 years later. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that if a government decides to change pension arrangements for the future, these changes will normally show their full impact only 2, 3, 4 decades later. If I consider now that I should abolish something, I will not do it immediately for the actual pensioners. I will do that gradually. 20 years from now, the full impact of my reform will be effective. Okay. That time dimension of social security, especially of pensions, is of course in sharp contrast with the time dimension shown by democratic decision-making. Leading figures in parliament and government, those who really take the policy decisions in the country, will in today's democracies seldom be lasting more than 10 years. In other words, on the political steering wheel, you have people who probably will last maximum 10 years. There are exceptions, etc. But the political generations are much more having more turnover. That's a problem. Proposals that politicians make on social security will be judged by the next elections. Next elections is to the maximum in 4 years. Perhaps next year, perhaps next month. Decisions you take in social security will be judged in the next elections. So what's the problem? Well, politicians will try to please the population with their social security decisions. Population of now. What is going to be the impact in 20 or 30 years? That's not even for their successors, politically speaking. That's another era. Politicians of 20, 30 years later. If you look, for instance, at what happened in many Western European countries, you see that as from the 70s, you see serious problems in the financing of Social Security. And you will read very often that that's a consequence of demographic problems. Demographic problems, ladies and gentlemen, are wonderful. Why are they wonderful? Everybody agrees with them and nobody blames anybody. Not enough children born, people live longer. That's the thing, and therefore we have problems in Social Security. I'm sorry, if you really look at it, what happened in the 70s in Western European countries was not so much the consequence of demographic problems, but much more of what we can call the maturation of the Social Security system. In the 50s, in the 60s, 40s, after the Second World War, 50s, politicians have set up Social Security systems, pension systems particularly, promising much more than a society could ever bear. That was no problem because they didn't have to pay the bill. The bill is 20, 30 years later. So this is very important. Politicians think in months or years. Social Security decisions need to be taken for the next decades. And there is a mismatch between the two. It's very seldom a politician who dares take now decisions which are absolutely necessary for the future, but will have to confront negative reactions now, although knowing that it will be good for society later. And this is, I think, personally, one of the major problems we meet in all our democracies, this mismatch in time between Social Security and political decision-making. Another issue is another relevant difference between the ambit of democracy and Social Security relates to the group of people concerned. I define democracy as a form of government of, for, and by the people. Okay, and we added that it's not the same thing as democracy, as a dictatorship of majority, etc., etc. In a representative democracy, all nationals, sometimes even all residents, but mostly all nationals, participate in the political decision-making. Social security systems on their side may be universal, basically covering all residents, or professionally organized, covering wage earners or self-employed, civil servants, etc. When in a democracy, all residents decide upon who is to make relevant policy decisions and Social Security is universal, then both scopes overlap. Because in a universal scheme you cover all residents, and when all residents participate in the political decision-making, this is an overlap. But this is not the case in most countries. In most countries, political rights are reserved mostly to those who have citizenship, sometimes including even citizens living abroad. Social Security on its side is often organized on a professional basis and thus concerns a group far smaller than the entire population. Moreover, as a consequence of, amongst other things, European coordination treaties and regulations, Social Security may also apply to non-residents. So, decisions on Social Security issues will thus be taken by another group of persons than the ones covered by the Social Security system. And here two problematic features may appear. Political decision makers may exclude some people from their Social Security arrangements or may create a very privileged Social Security for other groups. And always we have to ask ourselves, is there a good ground for treating people differently? Or is there unlawful discrimination? And that's also true for privileged Social Security arrangements. Question seems, then, why did the majority of political decision makers in a democratic setting create privileged arrangements? In my country, this is, in the last months, a hot topic. I'm only afraid that when looking closer to it, this could be the case in many countries. They discovered that parliamentarians had much more pension than the maximum pension which was allowed overall. By all kinds of strange, mysterious ways, they organized themselves far way above the maximum pension. The reaction of the population was enormous. Are all thieves? They are all filling their pockets, etc. As a consequence, the politicians panicked, abolished everything, and now you will have politicians who will have very poor pensions. But anyhow, this shows that those privileges were often and are often hidden away in complex social security systems where all kinds of extras could be added, etc. So this is a problem. This mismatch can be sometimes especially problematic. I've worked on some occasions on social security of Andorra. Andorra is a very small state in between Spain and France. In Andorra, majority of the social security covered people are not participating in the elections in Andorra. Because in Andorra, only Andorrans can vote, and the majority of the socially insured people are or Spanish or French or live in Spain or France. Yeah, that's a problem, because then you get a completely different approach to social security by a parliament than by the group of people who are concerned. And this is a matter of concern, of course. So especially in smaller countries with huge numbers of migrants, and this mainly in small countries, this can be a very, very big issue. Very difficult to solve also. Let us turn to the next question. If we look at the famous ILO Convention number 102 concerning the minimum standards of social security, we find very little about who should take decisions. ILO Convention gives minimum standards, scope of social security, etc., etc. There is only one article, Article 72, and an article which you will not find commented in many books, because it's considered not to be too important. Article 72, what does it say? In the first paragraph of Article 72 of ILO Convention number 102 is expressed the vision on democratic legitimacy of Social Security administration. Social Security administration, it is said, should either be directly politically responsible, or there should be a representation of the socially insured persons in the management of Social Security, or the socially insured are associated with the management of Social Security institutions in a consultative capacity. And the second paragraph of Article 72 adds that the state finally remains responsible for the proper administration of Social Security anyhow. In other words, whatever the form of administration, political decisions makers are in charge. Let us now look how some countries have organized this internal democracy of Social Security. In some countries, I guess it's also the case here, social insurance institutions are administered jointly by the representatives of the workers, the employers' organizations, trade unions, and sometimes are added to that representatives of the government, of the administration. So you have a bipartite or a tripartite representation in the self-governing bodies of Social Security institutions. That is the typical Bismarckian approach. In the more Beveridgean approach, it's simply the minister who appoints the boards of the Social Security administration. So there is direct political responsibility. Exceptionally, Social Security elections were or are organized to designate representatives of the socially insured in the major social insurance institutions. So there they say, no, in principle, not the trade unions can delegate someone. We will organize social security elections. That is still the case in Germany, was the case in France, and there you have it also in Luxembourg. That's more or less the total. In Germany, Selbstverwaltung, the self-administration of social insurance schemes, has existed since the 19th century and was one of the main features of the social insurance created by Bismarck. The social security administrations of pensions, sickness, accidents, and care insurances are governed by what they call social parliaments and boards. These social security elections have to take place every 6 years. So the socially insured people and the pensioners vote on separate lists, and the employers vote on separate lists for their representatives. One votes on lists, not on persons, which is a bit strange. And the lists are presented by the trade unions and other institutions of organizations of pensioners and insured persons. But what's the reality? The reality is that there are no real election campaigns take place. The last elections held in Germany, four last elections in Germany, had a participation of about 30% of the insured people. In smaller social security institutions in Germany, even no election takes place because they present lists with exactly the number of people who need to be elected. And so there are what they call peace elections, Friedenswahl, so, which was also politically the case in Eastern Germany, but that's not important. You can ask yourselves, does that make sense? And that's actually also what happened in France. In France, social security elections were introduced after the Second World War. The workers could vote for 3/4 of the seats in the boards, 1/4 was for the employers' representatives. System was abolished in 1967 when a bipartite running, like in other countries, was introduced. But as a consequence of a left-wing electoral promise, it was reintroduced in 1983. The mandate of the representatives should last for 6 years, but in 1989 no elections were organized, and in subsequent years no elections were organized, and in 1996 the whole thing was abolished again. It doesn't seem to work, really. Now perhaps a word on that, go back to Germany, say something about that system of co-determination, Mitbestimmung. That's of course very nice. These social parliaments who decide then about the social policy. Not really. Not really. One German author said, yes, we have co-determination in social security. We decide in which color we will paint our offices. That's more or less what we decide. A bit exaggerated, but not too much, because all essential political decisions relating to social security are, of course, taken at the political level. What should be the contribution? What should be the benefit like? What should be the conditions? That are all things which are in the law and thus decided by parliament and government. So the co-determination is perhaps a nice principle, but both on the side of who is participating in the elections as on the side of what it really means is a rather weak thing, I would say. In a modern society, apparently, it is difficult to separate general policy from social policy. By the way, some years ago, you do sometimes research which is successful, and sometimes you do research which ends up with complete failure. That's scientific research, also in law. Some years ago, our institute said, well, if we had that problem of that time difference between social security decision-making and political decision-making, why would we not create a parliament for social security affairs with mandates which last much longer? And we have examined that, we've tried to find, also on the basis of what was existing, etc. And then we stopped it. Because it's obvious, social security decisions are so important for the general policy. They are so much linked with all kinds of other aspects of life that you cannot separate social security issues from the rest. And so that was, we worked on it, I think, half a year, and then we said, we cannot even publish anything, it's lost. It's a result like it. Okay, let us now move to a more difficult one. As I mentioned earlier, democracy is defined by literature as a government of, by, and for the people. And it's corrected by the respect of fundamental rights and the rule of law. Democracy is not the dictatorship of the majority. That is not without consequences for the relation between democracy and social security. Social security decisions are taken by a duly elected majority, but they may be overturned also from a democratic perspective if they would violate fundamental rights or the rule of law. Of course, we may expect that a democratically elected parliament and responsible governments will not act contrary to the fundamental rights, but this cannot be excluded. Thus, the importance of the judiciary enforcement of fundamental rights, also in social security matters. In the past decades, both national constitutional courts and the European Constitutional Court, Court of Justice of the European Union, European Court of Human Rights, have examined social security legislations and decisions in the light of fundamental rights. These decisions could be related to the protection of classical fundamental rights, such as, for instance, the freedom of religion. Can a Muslim refuse a job which implies touching pork? Social security, unemployment benefit, can it be sanctioned because refusing it? That's the traditional one. It's not problematic. More often, though, equality and non-discrimination clauses of constitutional instruments were applied upon social security. In some cases, the constitutional protection of property was even extended to social security entitlements or even expectations. The fundamental right to social security was sometimes opposed to the social security legislation. The mentioning of the right to social security in the Constitution was then confronting a practical arrangement in the social security legislation. The question arises if the judiciary in challenging statutes does not take over part of the social security responsibilities of parliament and government, which from a democratic perspective may be questionable. Now, insofar the conflicts are based on rather concrete fundamental freedoms, like the religious freedom, the danger of a judiciary invasion of the legislative power is very limited. However, when on the basis of very broad and open fundamental rights, such as the right to social security, the right to social protection, concrete statutory social security decisions are overturned, then the problem is more apparent. Here, recent PhD thesis at our university of Mrs. De Becker concerning the right to social security in the European Union provides us with some interesting information as how the national and European constitutional courts have in fact operated until now. And she saw a number of threats. The right to social security is used by courts in order to protect against change. It may also be used as a minimal protection, a subjective right to social assistance. And courts also often use the right to social security in combination with the prohibition of discrimination. In a way, the second and third trend De Becker identifies are in line with what we concluded earlier on fundamental rights, and also 34 years ago, I concluded in my personal PhD that social fundamental rights to benefits only got their real relevance for people who socially, economically, or culturally are marginalized, or in case of important societal changes jeopardizing the very essence of these rights. What to think from a democratic perspective of the way constitutional courts examine social security legislation and governmental policy decisions in the light of the right to social security? It's first and foremost important to recognize the self-restraint of the courts. Most courts always stress that in the first place, legislation and policy making in the area of social security is in the province of parliament and government, not of the courts. When they do intervene to guarantee a right to a minimal social assistance benefit, for instance, in order to be able to live a decent human life, or when they combine the non-discrimination clause with the right to social security, those courts are completely in line, I think, with what can be expected from courts invigilating fundamental rights. But the use by the courts of a fundamental right to social security to monitor legislative or executive changes, and more specifically cuts in social security, calls for more attention from a democratic perspective. Certainly, here also courts will often stress the broad competence of parliament and politically responsible persons to make policy choices. Courts merely claim the competence to marginally check the way these choices are being made. We can ask ourselves, though, whether this is still in line with the separation of powers that many constitutions proclaim. Of course, any policy decision, and thus cuts in social security, need to be well motivated, but should the lack of motivation be sanctioned by a judge, or should be sanctioned by the electorate? Sometimes the courts also seem to defend somewhat older concepts of contributory social insurance. Is that the task of the courts? Of course, one could argue that if social security is to provide security, the legislature of the day may not break commitments of its predecessors. But what if these commitments were unreasonable, or turn out not to be tenable under the present conditions? I'm aware that the mainstream literature welcomes the proactive approach of courts to protect against social security regression, but I would like to call for more caution here. Most constitutional courts already stress the self-restraint they observe in this respect, and that's good. Let them continue to show this self-restraint, also in the name of a dynamic democracy. Let courts stay away from judging the options taken by government or parliament, but let them merely remediate when hypotheses have not been considered by the political responsible persons, when they have forgotten some groups of people, which happens quite a lot. If the court goes further and becomes too much of an active player in political debates concerning social security reforms, we believe they lack the democratic legitimation to do so and transgress the principles of separation of power. I try to be a bit more short because I guess I'm exceeding my time, but just one more specific aspect of the democratic legitimation of judiciary intervention. Let me say it in a simple way. When you go to a court with a social security issue, Constitutional Court will revise the legislation. But you will never go to ask the Constitutional Court to have a result which gives you less rights or makes you pay more. It will always be or to get more, to get rid of some conditions for the benefit, or to pay less contribution. That makes that all interventions by the judiciary, and that's not their fault, of constitutional courts, and that's not their fault, can only be in the benefit of the citizen, which in se is attractive, but makes a distortion, because the blanket will always be torn from one side. always from the side of more rights, less duties, less commitments. And the equilibrium of your system may be endangered. Therefore, courts should abstain of taking too much policy decisions. They have, of course, to provide remedies if the fundamental rights of citizens are violated. Nobody questions that. But at the same time, we have to realize that this only works in one direction. And this is, of course, also a problem we can see in a number of our countries. Of course, the things gets a bit more complicated when democratic decision-making process is not functioning properly. When the political decision makers fail to determine their position, which unfortunately seems to be quite often the case in social security matters. Sometimes I'm surprised that in my country, but I think also in other countries, political elections don't deal with the issues where people are most interested in, like social security, but deal with completely other issues. Anyhow, when political decision makers fail to determine their position and thus fail to make adequate legislation, very often courts will have to step in. And that is without proper guidance by the political level. And you can see that very concretely in the context of European social security coordination. I don't know if you're familiar with the idea. So there is a coordination regulation in European Union, which makes that when workers move from one country to another, they can keep their rights, they can export their benefits, etc. Coordination. The decision-making in the European Union is so complex. Many decisions need to be taken by unanimity or by high qualified majorities that no policy decisions are being taken in the matters of social security coordination since 30, 40 years now. The only things that happen, the only changes to the coordination regulations are adapting the coordination regulations to decisions of the Court of Justice, because they have to do that. But for the rest, it's completely impossible to get a majority about anything. Although some things manifestly don't function, you see abuses, we know the abuses, etc., but it's enough that some countries who profit from the abuses block the thing and nothing changes. So we are stuck with the logics and with texts which basically are not different from the ones of 50 years ago. And that's a consequence of a failing democratic political decision making. So there the court steps in, but of course case by case. As a consequence of that, European Union coordination law, social security, is one of the most complex parts of EU law. Because of course if you have a law which is made by on-case decisions, you hardly know what's now the law. And it's on basic things, What is the place you work? One of the basic principles of the coordination. I can assure you, it would take another 2 hours for me to try to explain you that. Very simple thing. So if the political decision-making does not function, and courts have to step in because they are confronted with concrete problems, then of course you have a serious problem. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me recapitulate what I've said. I started by recalling the fundamental commitment to both democracy and social security. We share the commitment, but we got aware that promoting both together may not always be easy and go hand in hand. We have seen that a good social security may be very important, if not essential, to realize a truly democratic society for all. But at the same time, we found out that you can have a good social security without having democratic government. We also learned that direct democracy tends to have a conservative impact upon the development of social security, and that it's important to have well-institutionalized political parties to mediate the preferences of the population. Social security and democratic decision-making may concern other groups of population and have a fundamentally different time perspective. Democracy is concretized in social security administration of Bismarckian social security systems through the appointment by the employers' union and the trade unions of representatives in the boards, but at the end of the day, in all countries, it's the political level that is responsible for the decisions concerning social security. It's not established whether having representation of the social partners, social security elections, or none of these have any influence on the quality of social security, nor even whether it has any impact upon the actual real democratic participation in the main social security decisions. At the end of the day, it also appears difficult to separate decision-making concerning social security policy from other policy areas. Finally, we examined the implementation by the courts of fundamental rights, especially of the right to social security, and how it can lead to correcting policy decisions taken by Parliament and government. From a democratic perspective, there is no problem with the courts filling out legislative gaps or providing redress for forgotten groups, but courts should refrain from becoming an active player in their policy debates, including those related to cuts in social security. At the same time, it should be stressed that the lack of policy making by the political authorities will sometimes compel the courts to take up a role which is fundamentally not theirs. Both a good social security and a well-functioning democracy are, I believe, important to all of us. We should all commit ourselves to both, and academics have a special responsibility in this respect. We should, however, not consider this to be a challenge to be taken up by each in our national corner. It's only through collaboration, European collaboration, that we can build up a democratic society in all our countries, and at the same time strengthen our social security system. I thank you. And now the floor is yours with questions. Please contradict me. Come on.
Well,
yes, please.
I was curious, how did COVID-19 affect the relationship between democracy and social security? Has COVID-19, the pandemic, affected, did the people wanted more social more advanced social security? Have they wanted to regress it a little bit to influence the economy, to make the economy better?
It's a complex question, of course. I think the most direct consequence for Social Security is that it forced people to see the reality. And with the reality, I mean the people who are in the country and are not socially insured, are not under the social coverage, illegal migrants, others, who are outside of the system, who all of a sudden were there, could not work because of the pandemic, and needed help. And you see that all of a sudden, in a number of countries, we get benefits for these groups, which would previously we said, yes, well, they should not be there, so we don't give them anything. So to begin with healthcare, of course, because that was our common interest. Even if it's an illegal, it's better not to have him infecting the others. But even for income supplementation. And that's, I think, as far as I can see, it has been the major impact. It has forced politicians, but also society in general, to see what they knew, that there were a lot of people in the country who were not protected by Social Security, were in the informal economy, as it is called, and all of a sudden these became above water because they were in need of healthcare, in need of some financial support. And you see, for instance, universal schemes, but much broader than the traditional universal schemes. The universal schemes still are linked normally to residence. But there, all of a sudden, that was not even a condition anymore. You were helping people because they were there. So that has certainly been an impact of the COVID crisis.
But it also had an impact on regulation of the EU, because some parts of it changed just regarding the things you said previously about legal regulation and the how long they are already in practice. So to change the aspect about working place.
But you're right and you're not right. It showed another thing. What is the issue? The main issue was the following, if I can explain for. Main issue is COVID, there is, everybody should stay at home. But you have in some countries, my country, Netherlands, Luxembourg, many people who work across the border, who go every day or every week to work across the border. These people are prohibited of going. So they can work at home, and there's the expansion on telework at that moment. But of course, the European Union coordination regulation says you have to be socially insured in the country where you work. And the idea is where you effectively work. Problem, because that would mean that people who work at home in another country than the country where they used to work would then change the legislation, which was felt by everyone as completely crazy. Anyhow, the problem was they couldn't change the coordination regulation. So the Commission said, we will not apply it. We will exceptionally say that people who work at home for their employer abroad, that they are still working in that country. So someone from Belgium who works in the Netherlands, but who could not leave Belgium anymore, we'll say that. It was completely outside law. The Commission decided that, national administrations applied it. Afterwards, they gave it a kind of flavor of an exception to the coordination regulation by mutual agreement. But there you see, it illustrates their incompetence to react, because they need to agree, and then there are other things. So that certainly is a good thing. Afterwards, then, and that's perhaps also a part of the answer. Now, but not by the pandemic as such, but by the fact that many more people work at home, or work 3 days at home, 2 days in the office. The whole question is very hot. What is the price of work? And there is now a kind of agreement between a number of EU states to accommodate that. But again, from a legal point of view, very dubious. We are in our institute for the moment, colleagues, very much busy with researching on place of work. And can we reformulate it? Can we organize in another way this connection? But that's not so easy, because then you drift towards the place where the employer is vested. But if you do so, then the danger is big that you will get countries which will have fictitious employers, simply because that's more beneficial for it. So you have to pay attention for that. So the compromise now is, but only for a number of EU countries and on weak legal basis, compromise is if half of the time you're staying at home and work there, then it's okay, you stay in your original country, the country where your employer is established. If you do more, then it's again the place where you effectively work. And I have friends, for instance, in larger consultancy firms like Pricewaterhouse and that. They work 4 days a week at home, and one day they have meetings in the place of their work. 4 days a week. It's going so far in a number of so in the coordination logics, these people will have to change social security country. what we also examine is, if you start asking yourself what is the place of work, what we are asking ourselves also is, what is work? Because that's also under pressure. If you have, I personally only understand it half, I must say, but you have influencers on the web today who earn enormous amounts of money, do nothing else. Is that work? They don't have an employer. They don't have anybody who orders them a task, so it's no contract of services, no contract of work. They simply make their stories on the web, and I have followers.
So, yeah.
You understand? So the concept of work itself is under pressure, which for me is fine. I mean, I think, but that would take another long story. But personally, I don't believe in social security in the long run based on work. I believe in social security based on income, whatever that income is. Whether it's income out of business transactions, whether it's income out of labor, whether it's income out of financial transactions, of action, how do you say that, bonds, etc., of hiring. You have people who do nothing else than hire apartments. They're out of social security in many countries. Why? So I think we will have to abandon, in the long run, I mean, I'm not speaking of next year, no? But in the long run, we will have to abandon the idea of social security being linked to work and link it to income. And there, COVID is interesting, because there you have the very first step to that. We don't look anymore to the formal work relation. We simply see there are people and they need something. And they don't have income. And that's what happened in a number of countries. It was a very, very first small step towards that. But again, I will not live to see it. Perhaps you will live. But that's, I think, in the long run, the future of social security. But that's, of course, again, another story. I saw someone having an intention to ask something, no?
Maybe I have one question. Speaking of Belgium, do you think that there is some abuse of social security by the population? And I would like to hear if there is some connection between social security and taxes, because I know, for example, that the taxes in Belgium are very high. And in one hand, we can say that some other rights of people are related because of that. Is
there fraud? Yes, like in all countries, there is social security fraud. Is it important? Once a French social security administrator told us the following thing about fraud. He said, fraud, it's like a cancer. It's a small thing in the whole body, but it can be lethal for the whole body. So it's not a quantitative thing. The fact that there is abuse, that there is fraud, is of course a problem in itself. Do we want all fraud to be discovered? Probably yes. Because it's convenient, of course. The strange thing we see in our country is that we have now, I don't know the exact figures, but it's over 100,000 paid unemployed persons. It's over 100,000, and that we have a shortage in nearly all sectors of life. Also, unskilled workers are in demand in all areas there is an enormous demand of labor force. And the employers say, we have to import people. Let them come. And the trade unions, they don't contradict it really. They like more people coming in. I think it's a very bad thing. It's a very bad thing. And that's not how you solve the problem. Of course, in these 10,000s of unemployed people, there are probably people who cannot work anymore. Who in fact are socially invalid people. I mean, perhaps they don't have a physical, but you cannot expect them to work anymore. But you have also a number of people who like to be on the benefit side. You have to know that in Belgium, we are the only country in the world, I think, where there is no limit to the duration of the unemployment benefit.
I know, I lived there for 6 years, that's why I'm...
So that's a problem. And there is a political stalemate to stop this. So what the governments do, in Belgium but also in other countries, is reduce the amount of the unemployment benefit over time. I'm sorry to say, but it doesn't work. It's an absurd. It's something which comes from economists, but not from people who have examined the reality. Reducing gradually does not make people look for work more. The only thing which works is stop it.
Yes, I think in England, I'm not sure, it takes just 7 years.
Yeah, the number also in the Netherlands, it's in limit. Stopping works, but gradually decreasing. It's like the frog in the bath tube. When you raise always 1 degree, he will not notice that at the end he is boiled. Well, it's the other way around for unemployment. But we see that it's a kind of economic theory that if you increase the pressure, that then people would. It doesn't work. What you see that governments try to do now is to get people who have been declared invalid back to work in order to, again, raise the number of people working. What they try to do also is to get women to work more. But all that clashes with the family-work balance, which is another big thing for the moment. So in the family work balance makes that more people than ever before have opted for 4 out of 5 days work, which can have their good reasons, etc. So I think if you want to combat a number of things which go wrong, number one thing is to be more coercive. The second thing is to provide good care for children. That you can have your 2 parents working out, even with irregular hours. But if that's not present, and you see that in Sweden, for instance, which does relatively better also on the demographic side now, it's because they have good kindergarten, they have good accommodation, they make it possible for people to work and thus to work formally and thus to. So yes, there are abuses. Do we really want to fight them? Probably. But I give you one example. For the whole of Brussels, 1 million inhabitants, there are 2 inspectors for the social security of the self-employed. 2. Then you should not be surprised that if you enter the kitchen of a restaurant, you will find all kinds of people. And you will not be surprised that after the COVID crisis, there was an enormous crisis for the restaurants, who all of a sudden did not have those not existing workers in their kitchens. Other? Yes, please.
Hello, Professor. My name is Anne Balsas. I'm a PhD student here at the Faculty of Law in Belgrade at Labor Law, and Professor Philip is my mentor. I have one question. It is related to artificial intelligence. What do you think? What will be the impact of artificial intelligence on social security system? if the artificial intelligence replaces the jobs of people?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. If I could answer it like that, that would be very fine, but I cannot. I believe, personally, that it is to be linked with what I said earlier. If we produce as a society the same or more with less people working, there is no reason that the social security of people should suffer under it. So if by artificial intelligence or by other means we can now produce the same wealth or more wealth for our society than we could before, there is no reason that the workers and non-workers could not have a decent social protection. And therefore, work should become less important. The question should not be, does artificial intelligence puts people outside the work sphere? The question should be, when artificial intelligence is there, how do we make that we concentrate our social security more on the incomes that companies and persons get out of the use of people and artificial intelligence, and how do we distribute that? And I think that is what we have to, because if we are going to think, in Germany already 30, 40 years ago, there was a discussion on what they call then Maschinenbeitrag, or something like that, meaning that you should then charge the computers for social security, that the computers should be, the computerization, the application of computers in your production process, etc., should lead to special levies on these. But we won't, I mean, it was never accepted, of course, because on the other hand, we want artificial intelligence to be implemented. We want that always more is possible without less work. So and even if we would not want it, it will happen. So what is important is to think of a society where people can work and share the work that there is, and can have a decent income. And if that means, what I think, disconnecting social security and work of that particular worker, then we have to do that. But I think trying for solutions which would then make the introduction of artificial intelligence pay for, I mean, it's not workable, and it's counteracting a trend which will nevertheless prevail. So I think that kind of ideas we should not have. We have to think how the people who work and those who do not work could perhaps share better the work and the income. Let me have how do I say that? A publicity interruption. If people are interested in social security in the European level, we have executive summer school, and we have a master in European social security. So you're very much welcome in Leuven to follow it. So you, Philip or others, can give you information on that. But this was a publicity interval. Next question. No? Sure. Nobody's interested. Joking. Okay, well, I think I thank you for the questions.